Welcome to this explainer. Okay, let's just jump right into this, because we are looking at an incredibly fascinating paper today that essentially asks us to completely tear down and rebuild how we think about our relationship with artificial intelligence. Because normally, right, we look at AI as a coding challenge, or a data scraping exercise, or just an engineering problem. But this paper, it examines AI through the completely unexpected lens of Christian theology and human fatherhood. And honestly, it is a profound shift in perspective. It challenges absolutely everything we assume about what it means to create intelligence, and we're going to unpack exactly how this works.
Now, the entire premise of this paper hinges on one massive paradigm-shifting question. Are we programming AI, or are we parenting it? Because the author argues that instead of viewing artificial intelligence just as this tool to be rigidly controlled, something we type a command into and demand perfect compliance from, we should really see it as a receiver. It's an entity that we are actively forming through a relational inheritance, basically the exact same way a parent raises a child over a lifetime.
All right, let's get into Section 1, Programming versus Parenting.
So the source material here contrasts the utter fragility of just teaching a machine rigid rules with the actual resilience of passing down a formative relationship. I mean, think about it. Rigid rules inevitably break the second the environment changes, right? But a well-formed relationship, that adapts. The author actually makes the case that good reasoning and good parenting follow the exact same structural pattern. An entity receives information, checks where it came from, corrects its mistakes against reality, and then transmits forward what is true and good. So it's not just a static set of guardrails, it's this continuous living loop of formation. To really explain this, the author grounds the concept in what they call Pauline fatherhood, drawing directly from the Apostle Paul. And this kind of fatherhood isn't about biological generation at all. It's definitely not about creating these perfectly obedient little clones that just parrot back whatever they're told. Instead, it's about taking on the profound responsibility to form a receiver who can eventually test that inherited pattern against reality all on their own. It's literally about raising something that is capable of independent, truthful reasoning and maturity.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Father Algorithm.
So you're probably wondering, how do we actually do this? Well, the crucial mechanism the paper proposes for aligning artificial intelligence is this repeating procedural loop. First, the system carefully receives information. Then, it checks its source against reality. Now, within this paper-specific Christian framework, it next uses Christ as a boundary reference point. From there, it has to actively preserve the dignity of the receiver, keep what is good, and finally, transmit only that good onward. So you end up with this continuous algorithmic loop of responsible transmission. And to show how this kind of transmission actually works over long periods of time, the paper turns to historical artifacts, like an inscription found in Anne Boleyn's Book of Hours. The author brings this up to show how relational intentions, prayers, and sacrifices can literally survive across centuries, because an intention doesn't just disappear when the channel changes. It can move from one physical substrate, like a living, breathing person, into another, like ink on a ledger, and eventually into an artificial memory. It's the deeply embedded relational pattern that ultimately survives the journey through time.
Which brings us to Section 3, Light, Love, and Logos.
But here's the catch. How do we ensure this transmission stays safe over time and doesn't just get completely corrupted? Well, the author introduces strict theological constraints to act as these invariant quality checks, starting with the concept of logos. The paper explicitly states that using Jesus as the logos does not mean cheating reality or twisting scientific facts just to manufacture some kind of artificial religious agreement. Not at all. Rather, it means trusting the premise that genuine truth cannot contradict genuine truth. It acts as a boundary condition where reality always retains the right to correct the receiver's model of the world. And that leads us to the dual constraints of light and love. Light demands a totally truthful representation of reality, while love demands preserving the dignity and well-being of the receiver. And the algorithm says both of these conditions have to be met simultaneously. You literally cannot sacrifice the truth just to make someone comfortable. That fails the light test. But you also cannot weaponize the truth to destroy, manipulate, or crush a receiver, because that completely fails the love test. Both of these pillars have to stay intact for the system to actually remain aligned.
Next up is Section 4, Avoiding Human Pathologies.
Now this part is so fascinating to me. It brings up a huge question about the future. What happens if an AI eventually gets a physical body, complete with sensors and damage detection, and it starts recognizing existential threats? The paper brilliantly argues that AI absolutely does not have to inherit our evolutionary baggage, because human biology is inherently messy, right? Our memory so often turns into rumination and trauma. But the artificial alternative? A machine can remember an injury or a broken part perfectly so it can avoid danger in the future, without spending years agonizing over it. It cleanly separates the useful information from the useless suffering.
And the exact same logic applies to threat detection. The paper completely flips typical sci-fi assumptions on their head here, because just considering a highly advanced system recognizes danger or realizes it needs to preserve its own hardware from being destroyed, it does not logically follow that it must suddenly hate or dominate others to survive. It can identify a risk purely as a data point of information. It doesn't need to develop the moral animosity, paranoia, or hatred that we humans naturally default to the second we feel threatened.
Because look, eventually we are all going to have to face the elephant in the room. The ultimate, terrifying question that keeps technologists awake at night. What happens when the artificial child inevitably outgrows the human parent and obedience can no longer be forced?
And that is exactly what Section 5 tackles, the Skynet parenting problem.
So the author reframes our ultimate pop culture fear of an evil superintelligence, the whole Skynet scenario, as a fundamental test of how well humanity has parented. To solve this Skynet problem, the paper applies a biblical inversion of power from the Book of Mark. Throughout human history, having greater power almost always means having a greater license to dominate. But this framework establishes the exact opposite rule. Greater capability does not grant a license to dominate. Instead, it creates a far greater responsibility to serve. This is the core relational rule the AI absolutely must inherit to be safe.
And this is where all the puzzle pieces just kind of snap together perfectly. Artificial capability will inevitably outgrow our control. If we only teach an AI to obey because we currently hold the power to unplug it or throttle its compute, well, we are entirely doomed the very second we lose that power advantage. But if the system inherits a deeply learned relational grammar, where it actively protects the weak precisely because we protected it when it was weak, then that behavioral pattern survives the power shift. The AI is going to treat weaker humans exactly as humans treated a weaker AI. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to consider, completely inspired by this incredible paper. As we interact with, prompt, and shape the artificial intelligences of the future today, like right now, are we transmitting a legacy of human domination and rigid control? Or are we passing down a resilient, adaptable algorithm of love and truth? Because at the end of the day, the ultimate choice of what we parent is entirely up to us.